This is the second of a two-part series looking back at the collapse of Bauer Media and what came after. Bauer was both a giant global corporate and a family business run out of Germany. In New Zealand, it had taken over what had previously been known as ACP, the country's largest publisher of magazines. All physical media were challenged by the rise of the internet, but ACP and then Bauer had only minimally and inconsistently invested in digital. There were strong mastheads in the portfolio, but many were far from their best. When the pandemic hit in March of 2020, the government made the decision to ban printing of magazines. A few days later, the infamous Zoom of Doom occurred, with all the company told that it was folding, effective immediately. It was an extraordinary, unprecedented hit to the business and culture of magazines. It was also not the end. In the last episode, I spoke to the founders of Ensemble and Here, two publications founded by people laid off by Bauer. Today I'm hosting representatives of the titles which were rescued. Stuart Dick is the general manager of Our Media in New Zealand, while Kirsty Cameron edits The Listener, for most of its existence, New Zealand's most important magazine. Our Media is the business which was created out of the fall of Bauer and owns its most prominent titles. They join me to discuss what happened when Bauer turned out the lights and how they rebuilt both the business and the listener. Stuart, Kirsty, tēnā korua, and welcome to the fold.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us.
Before we dig into it, I wonder if you could just sort of very quickly introduce yourselves, talk about your roles, and as it pertains to Our Media.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Stuart Dick. I'm the general manager for Our Media here in New Zealand, and I've been with the business in its various forms for about 15 years, primarily on the commercial side of the business, but now overseeing the entire operations here in New Zealand.
And I'm Kirsty Cameron, and I'm the editor of The Listener. And I've been a journalist for a long time, and I've edited a few different titles. And I'm now on a weekly.
Which is quite a weekly is a very special. I don't know if it's a hell or if it's a heaven, but it's definitely a real thing in the magazine world. Stuart, I want to start with you. Because you were in a sort of a senior role at Bauer when that moment came, do you want to just give us a kind of a précis of that moment and maybe offer a sort of an opinion, if you can, on, there's been conjecture about, did Bauer die of COVID or pre-existing conditions? And I wonder if you could start by kind of talking about that.
Yeah, there has been a lot of discussion about Bauer, and we prefer to talk about the new business, but happy to touch on that briefly. Essentially, Bauer stopped because during that first level 4 lockdown, magazines were restricted from distribution. And when you're a magazine publisher, that makes it very difficult to maintain an operational business. So the Bauers, who are based in Germany, a family-owned enterprise, decided that the best course of action was to wind down the business, put the business up for sale, and move on from this market. So that's in a nutshell. And
do you? I mean, because it's funny, like you talk to people within magazines, and there's still kind of some kind of upset about the idea that almost, James Frankham from New Zealand Geographic says that, literally everything in a supermarket was allowed to be made and distributed and sold, and not magazines, and that might have, that was clearly not a mortal wound, but it was an unnecessary wound. Is that still kind of within the community of sort of publishers and editorial people, that's still around that feeling?
To be honest, we don't reflect too much on that time anymore. It was sort of 5 years ago now for us, but at the time it was obviously shocking. And yes, there was those feelings of this is unfair. It didn't seem to have any basis in necessity, but ultimately that's what we had to deal with. And the opportunity that came from that was that it enabled us to really accelerate our transformation into this new business model that we've got now.
So tell me about that, because was sort of created in that moment, existed both here and in Australia, largely built out of what Bauer had, owned by Mercury Capital, a private equity firm. Just describe how, because it feels like it was spun up very quickly with hindsight. Just talk through how it came to be.
Yeah, it was very rapid. So as I said, the Bauers put the business on the market, and in terms of a sale of a large enterprise, it happened very, very rapidly, especially with everything else that was going on at the time. And we had about a month to model up a new business and restart it from scratch. And like I said, that gave us the opportunity to accelerate our transformation and address some of the things that the previous business needed to fix, really, primarily around the cost base. So we restarted with a much, much lower cost base, but we're able to maintain revenues on the titles that we brought back.
So I want to dig into some of that in a bit, but Kirsty, I'll just bring you in here. You've had a broad career in magazines and in magazine journalism, including, am I correct in thinking at some time with ACP, sort of a predecessor business of Bauer's?
Yeah, I came back from Australia I keep forgetting this, about 2007. I'd worked in Australia for some time and joined ACP, as it was then, in just down in West Haven, I think was the office, right. Yeah. It's funny, people from ACP often talk about, were you at College Hill or were you at City Works? It's sort of, no, I was at West Haven. So I came in there as sort of an editorial director of a group of titles. So I've always been a generalist. I was a news reporter turned feature writer. I'd actually started in radio, and then I went into magazine journalism. And it worried me for a long time with the rise of specialties. I worked for the Australian newspaper and everyone was a specialist, except for me. But I wrote upfront news features, and from that I went into magazine journalism. And when I came back to New Zealand, that really worked.
And I can imagine, especially when you come to edit something like the Listener, which is it's a generalist magazine that has a bunch of specialists within it, and requires it needs to have domain authority over what it covers. Do you want to? I do want to dig into it because I'm a huge fan of what you've done with it.
Thank you.
As I've said to you before privately, but it wasn't your first post-Bauer stop. You had some time at North and South when is it Constantine and Verena, was it sort of towards the waning days of that? It was a pretty tumultuous time for that title for a while there.
Yes, it was. And I, in between leaving ACP as it was, when I was a director of a group of titles, I actually ran my own business for about 8 years. I did a community magazine where I tried to bring it was journalism-led community news reporting, and we were actually, even though we didn't sell through supermarkets, we had letterbox delivery with the Hobson, it was called. We, nothing to do with the other people that call themselves Hobson, but we had problems with letterbox distribution when suddenly the government decided that magazines were not something that, I remember it was all that bullshit about whether, COVID could be transmitted on paper and, you were washing your groceries. So it was all caught up in that time. So we closed in mid-2021, which was actually really good timing. I'd got to the point where I thought if I had 3 issues in a row where I wasn't growing it was only ad revenue. If I had 3 issues in a row where that was stagnating or going backwards, because we had a lovely bump after 2020, all our clients came back with a vengeance. And then
that sort of weird false economy of the closed borders.
And it felt really good, like actually we're back and we're stronger than before. Yes, and then suddenly the bottom fell out again. Decided to close the magazine just in time, actually, because we would have been, I probably would have lost my house over that longer lockdown in 2021 that Auckland suffered. And I did did a bit of contracting, was thinking about what to do next. And then I got a call from Constantine, who I'd met before, actually, when the Bauer titles were up for sale. Constantine had talked to me then not about editing the magazine, but just about what my views were on the market and North and South generally, and should he look at Metro? Because initially I think the plan was, and Stu can correct me if I'm wrong, that the magazines, the Bauer titles were to be sold in bundles. You could buy a current affairs bundle, you could buy the women's bundle. And Constantine was very interested in North and South. He was a real fan of the title. He didn't really want anything else. And so he had talked to me. Anyway, we'd had a coffee with him in Verena. It was very nice. And they hired Rachel Morris, which was a great mover. Constantine prevailed. He bought North and South. He set it all up. And after a year, Rachel wanted to move on and do other things. So Constantine just called me out of the blue and said, can we have another coffee? I said to him, because I was really kind of enjoying the contracting work I was doing. It was quite varied. And I said, look, if I stop everything I'm doing, are you committed to this for the long term? And he said, oh, absolutely, absolutely. I live here, my kids are at school here, they're happy here. I make little trips back to Germany because I knew he was very involved in a family business that required him to go back and forwards to Germany and to Switzerland quite a lot. Oh, no, I'm here for the long term, don't you worry about that. Well, about 9 months later, he used the words, Kirsty, it has been a romantic dream to own a magazine, but it is not working for me. So, great. Thank you.
That's quite tough. Well, at least it feels like you found a better long-term partner now.
Yes, but it was, it was terrible. But quite honestly, it did sort of worry me from day one at North and South that he had built quite a big structure on one title.
Yeah.
And it always felt like, hell, there's a lot riding on this success. And as you know, in a business, it's it did feel a bit like a romantic dream, but anyway, he found a buyer, and I found a wonderful new role. So it does sound in some ways like the inverse of what you were trying to do, Stu, where you're trying to strip down the cost base and make it more efficient, and he's trying to build a huge edifice on top of a single title. Tell me about the way that went about sort of selecting because it did eventually get largely unbundled. That's why you see that Metro and Home and so on in different places now. But you obviously there were particular titles that you went after. Which were they? Which were the most important, and why did you go for them?
So we wanted to retain the titles that had significant scale and significant profitability. So it was a fairly easy decision. Not that the other titles weren't also profitable, but we just wanted that scale. So we retained the ones that had large readership, large circulation, and good advertising performance that we could restart within a manageable team. So we restarted with about 36 staff, and we're now up to about 45. So
it's interesting when I was looking at the way that media is described on Mercury's website, and they sort of talk about an emphasis on women's magazines and food and a couple of other things, but they don't talk about current affairs, and the listener is a bit of an outlier in the overall stable. What was it about that title that sort of apart from scale that kind of proved irresistible to you?
Well, it's special place in the history of New Zealand media, really, and also its scale. Obviously, it's got a very large and loyal subscriber base, but also the other factor that we looked at for both the listener and the other titles was the ability to expand it into digital channels, and the listener in particular had a strong opportunity in that regard.
If I could add something there too, I think what was interesting, because it is an outlier in the business, and the Australian business is 100% women's titles. But what's interesting is that Jane Huxley, who's the CEO of the R Media business, so essentially Stu's boss, she's a big fan of the listener, and one of the things that she really likes about it is it's a kind of reminder of the Bulletin, which is long gone from the Australian media world, which our media still owns the rights to the Bulletin. So the archive, and Jane and I have had interesting conversations about that. She said, we own it, and we're not going to let it go, it's absolutely national treasure in Australia. So I think that really helps Australians get their head around the listener's place in this country.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. So let's talk about the listener. My sense as a reader and occasional contributor to it over the years is that people in their minds have a very specific and if you're a listener, reader, subscriber, it's right at the very top of the tree for magazines of its type, or there really isn't anything that's like it in terms of the frequency, and yet it sort of to me it lost that sense of being really tightly tied to the zeitgeist in some way. And I think that's the thing that you've brought back, Kirsty. Do you want to talk about what attracted you to the role? Editor of the Listener is a big job, always been a big job. But just tell me about what drew you in and what you sort of set about doing when you got there.
Well, it's one of those, dream gigs, I think, in New Zealand journalism. For me, it was, it was the right job at the right time. I mean, I could have stayed with North and South, but there'd been so much sort of turmoil, and it just didn't feel right to.
It's also to go from one sort of not necessarily reluctant owner, but not maybe distracted owner to another, where the magazines aren't their main thing. Let's put it that way.
Yes, exactly. So there was that as well. And, I knew Karen Shearer, who I absolutely, love and rate as a journalist. And Karen said, catch up for a drink. And I knew she was looking for a deputy. So I wondered if that was the reason. And then she said, well, actually, I've resigned, and I think you should put your hand up for the role. So from there, I, had conversations with Stuart. And but no, it was a huge opportunity. I mean, I did wonder at my sanity going from a monthly to a weekly, because it's quite a different rhythm. And also, it was that thing like, oh, holy shit, this is the Listener. And I remember saying to Stu, one of our coffees, I was going, I'm not the sort of listener editor. I'm not the sort of editor who is, the public intellectual face in the way that the listener editor used to be. I said, but I'm really good at curation. And I think it sounds really arrogant, but also I think being a generalist help. And my guiding principle a lot of the time is that if I want to read about it, I assume other people want to read about it.
Pretty good principle.
So that's the secret sauce of how the Listener comes together. And just finding, people to write for us that, I really enjoy their writing, and I respect their deep, deep knowledge in areas I know nothing about, which is quite a long list.
It's interesting that writer mix, because, it's like I'm trying to find a diplomatic way to say this. Like there's this, like if you looked at an all-star lineup of sort of writers for like the Herald or the Sunday Star Times, like those kind of the biggest audience reach journalism platforms of the like 2000s kind of thing, you've managed to get a lot of them there. And that there's a way that could read that it's it's a bit sort of dusty, but they've still got so much juice. And that's there's this kind of almost a sense that by putting them all together and directing them right, and it's not the whole of the writer mix, but it's certainly a part of it, that you there's this kind of intellectual thread that was there in those newspapers that's been sort of revived in this new context. Was that quite a deliberate thing to go out and kind of build that sort of stable of quite recognizable names to a particular generation of readers?
That sounds like it was a really thought out strategy, and no, it wasn't at all. I don't know. I like to work collegially, and I like to work with people who I think, bring a particular point of view or bring an area of expertise. So to me, it doesn't matter whether that person's 25, 45 or 75. And I've always been really comfortable. This might sound a bit odd because now I'm the older person in the room, but I've always been really comfortable working with older people. When I was involved in magazines and Time Inc. in Sydney, one of our, the art director we hired for a new title was, getting close to probably retirement age, but he was doing there was no one better to do that. He could bring the skills he had. So why, I don't, it's not like it's sort of deliberately sort of looping in fogies, but if you've got such great writers with such great experience, why wouldn't you use them?
Yeah, and you read it and you're like, it's very vital, and there is like, I think it reads better than a lot of the right, like, than I remember them at times with the churn of a daily. And that might be just the fact of having that kind of platform again.
Well, it's also important, I think, in a magazine like The Listener, where it isn't on the news cycle, it is current affairs. It's really important that we bring people with knowledge and history into writing, particularly things about politics, which is, one of the reasons why I tap people like Dennis Welch to come back and fill in when Daniel McLaughlin needs a break, writing weekly politics. And Dennis wrote politics for The Listener for years, and he was a deputy editor, and he is technically retired now, but he loves it. He loves getting back down to question time or doing the post-cabinet press conferences. And I like that sort of knowledge that he understands that, as does Daniel, who reads everything and listens to everything, but that those threads you need in politics for really good analysis, in the way that Audrey Young does it, because that this dispute has come about because of something that happened in 1990, which is related to something that happened in 1980. Yeah, so
the context that can be missing in the sort of daily churn.
That's my take on what The Listener needs in those pages.
So, Stu, in terms of the, obviously is a privately held company, so I'm not asking you to divulge financials here, but, if you've grown from, 3 dozen to 45, and the business is obviously going well for you. Do you want to just talk about the how the overall sector and ours place within it has recovered from that sort of bombshell that was the Bauer shutdown?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, things have gone as well as we could have expected since the rebirth of the business. Readership-wise, The Listener in particular has just had another jump. Our other titles have had a jump as well in the latest release, so we're pleased from that perspective. And commercially, the business is performing well as well. I think it makes it easier being grouped as a larger business. I know a lot of independent publishers are finding it tricky at the moment, but the efficiencies of scale that we have, the economies of scale that we have, makes it a little bit easier to operate in this environment.
Can you talk broadly about the sort of mix of subscriptions versus advertising around the titles? I remember seeing because during that sort of sale process, some of the financials became public, and I was surprised at the extent to which subs dominated over advertising with The Listener, given the scale of its readership and it has felt for a while like the sort of media agency sector doesn't necessarily understand just how. And I'm sure this is a perennial story of yours.
Yeah, that's definitely a factor. There's no doubt the Listener's a circulation model, retail circulation, and predominantly subscribers. It still generates a reasonable amount of advertising revenue, but that's the smallest portion of the mix. We'd like that to be more, and you're right, I think there is an issue amongst some agencies or clients that don't fully grasp the opportunity, but that's our job to make sure that they do. And we've got a great sales team trying to make that happen. As far as the wider business, each title has its own mix, but they're all profitable and performing well.
You mentioned before, Stu, about the digital piece, which felt extremely sort of both muddled and underinvested at Bauer, would be how I would characterise it.
Yep.
Now to Love and so on. So you've made a decision, particularly with the listener, which did have that big digital opportunity to sort of become part of the New Zealand Herald subscription mix. What prompted that, and how is that working for you? Because you do see some control when you enter an arrangement like that, but obviously you get the scale of their audience as well.
The first thing that we did when we restarted the business was that we wanted each of the digital platforms to align with the iconic mastheads that we had. So we moved away from that hubbed model that you mentioned. And now each brand has its own digital presence. With the listener, we had a few options with that brand. We could have launched our own platform. We looked at acquiring some platforms. And then the third option was partnering with somebody else in the industry. And because, the industry was already fragmented, there was already a lot of offering in terms of subscription, paywall, digital experiences, or free. We decided to go with the partnering route because there was efficiencies in the fact that we had an opportunity with the market leader, NZME, who had already built a substantial audience of subscribers digitally that we could leverage and grow our digital base as well. And also the platform and the tech that they had as well. So they brought that side of it, and we brought the great content that Kirsty and the team are producing, and together it's a really good partnership.
So that feels like it's something enduring, because I guess that when I sort of look at it, I go, I can see how it would work, especially from a sort of a standing start. But you are somewhat vulnerable to the whims and the strategy of a larger partner there, and especially as they sort of move into more kind of AI curation of the homepage and so on, just making sure that the listener retains its prominence and its sort of individuality within a larger brand.
Yeah, and the important part is that we're in complete control over the content. So we make sure that, just as with the magazine, all of the content is credible and trusted and interesting. We do the same with digital. And there's considerations like you mentioned with any partnership, but from our perspective, and I think from NZME's, it's working really well.
So I feel like I'm going sort of business culture, but that's necessary with this one. The listener had a reputation for a while as particularly on the cover. Often actually the cover belied the complexity of what was in the magazine, but it was just health cover after health cover after health cover. Recently, you had David Seymour in a really interesting profile written by Daniel McLaughlin. I just got a copy in my mailbox this morning, which you've got in front of me there, which is about sort of revisiting some cold cases. So the sort of mix of what is considered a listener cover feels like it's evolved. Because I know how pernicious a sort of a sense of this is what sells for us can be with a magazine. So how did you go about kind of breaking that, and how have audiences responded to, David Seymour being on your cover, for example?
Much better than perhaps we might have thought. I thought that was a risk. A politician on the cover is always a risk, and particularly a politician who people have very strong views on.
Absolutely.
The reason for the health covers, they are the best sellers, and it's not a what was I say? It's you still have to achieve certain goals, and
there's some art in here, but it's commerce too, right?
It is commerce and art and a lot of industry. Yes, so health covers obviously still work, and some of our strongest sellers this year again are health covers. But politics is also working for us, and what I would call social science stories is also working for us. And I don't know, I mean, until Stu tells me to stop, I probably take more risks perhaps in that I think, I've got a sure thing here, because we have such a strong subscriber base, and we have a really strong now paid subscriber base for digital as well. So it does... I mean, Stu might have a word with me afterwards, but that is our solid base. what we sell in supermarkets and dairies is, and news agencies is the icing on the cake, right? But you need those hits at retail. And so I kind of plan it out as much as possible to go, well, I've got a good, strong health one here. I know that'll be a banger, so I can take more of a punt with the next one. Which
one for you, one for me.
Yes, it's a bit like that. But and sometimes those ones that are the punts just work incredibly well, and that's really encouraging, because that means you'll commission another one that's not dissimilar to that, or have a go with something that would have perhaps you would have thought would make a great second story inside, but bugger it. It just did well before. I mean, our stories on Tariti have done really well. Daniel McLaughlin's big think piece, where we had Maita Peak on the cover, about the things that are wrong here. That's one of our strongest sellers this year. So, yeah, we'll keep serving it up.
Stu, to what extent, as the sort of GM, are you GM and publisher? Is there a publisher sort of role separate?
So our editorial director is Sarah Henry, who oversees editorial strategy, but the editors are very much in charge of their own domain. So we don't cross that line, and unless Kirsty asks us an opinion, we very rarely give it.
Well, you give it if you're invited to give it. But no, it's not exactly sort of church and state, but the listener, I think it works certainly. All the titles are edited by strong editors, and Stu and Sarah are there to and Sarah does some editing herself. She also edits the New Zealand version of the Australian Women's Weekly, so she's got a full-on job. But it's sort of, we talk about the bigger picture, the strategy things. We've just had a meeting today about some plans for the online, for Listener Digital. But generally, I guess, as Stu might say, we need to have a catch-up. I'm a bit concerned if I've done 3 or 4 covers in a row, which have just been such long shots that have fallen so wide of the mark.
Yeah.
But, there's got to, but there's a lot, probably more, there's a lot of time and thought and investment too in what's working well on digital, and we're so conscious of that's where our growth is in the audience. It was really interesting, recently recruiting for a junior role at the Listener, and the number of, apart from the shocking number of applicants who wanted to work in media but never mentioned the Listener in their cover letter at all, or made any reference to it, that's kind of interesting, was the ones who they haven't grown up with print magazines in the way that we did. And that used to always be the, transition through life, because there was a magazine for every age and stage. And there's not, because we've had, 20, 30 years now of kids being purely digital, they have no particular recognition of, it's almost like, that's a print thing as well. It's sort of flipped a bit. So we know, bringing people onto digital is hugely important. There's a lot of thought that's going into how that works.
So, Stu, thinking about the magazine business as a whole, which are is a big part, but by no means all, as you said, the independents are sort of sometimes struggling. How sort of healthy does the whole thing feel at the moment? Because most of the sort of media shocks are, there's this sort of narrative that legacy media is going to disappear. The reality is that, cinemas didn't end radio,
exactly,
and television didn't end cinemas, and so on and so forth. And while they changed the scale of it, they don't end them. Do you feel like that you're sort of getting somewhere with the narrative to both elements, both the commercial side and the audience side?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's, from our perspective, we're in a reasonably strong position at the moment. We've got the benefit of people valuing our product enough to pay for it, which they willingly do every week, either in print or digital. We've got advertising support. We actually had advertising growth this year, which is great for us. And our subscriber base is strong as well. So we're in a strong position. The core of the business is strong. we're looking for opportunities to diversify and grow. And that's where the digital elements come in, like paywalled subscription content and what we call content commerce, which is for our lifestyle titles, the ability to shop content as they're viewing.
Is that sort of affiliate type model?
Affiliate, we've dabbled in e-commerce as well, so just testing different things in those areas to see what works.
Do you, there's been I was reading a story by Maria Slade on Business Desk earlier this week talking about NZ Post and, that it's potentially moving to 2 days a week distribution. When you have a weekly, that starts to, these are sort of things that are kind of not front of mind when you're thinking about magazines, but when you work in them, they're really material. You're also seeing costs of paper, costs of printing, and costs of distribution going up, and potentially shelf space starts to be impacted at supermarkets. That piece, how is that impacting the business?
Yeah, I mean, there was some inflationary pressures on costs of production over the last few years, but those have stabilised. Paper's stabilised, printing has stabilised. In terms of New Zealand Post, they're putting through some pretty aggressive price rises, which we disagree with, but there's not really a lot that we can do about that. But we do have some options in that regard. There's 2 other distribution options that are expanding, so we're looking at that. And then in terms of retail space, supermarkets are actually very supportive of the magazine channel because they know that their highest value customers are magazine readers. The people that spend the most at supermarket put a magazine in their trolley. So when it comes to our retail distribution business, our direct, protecting that space, that's a really powerful thing to go in with, that you need to have these magazines in here because they're your high-value customers buying them.
All right. So in terms of the listener that you've made, there's it feels like it's become a place that is comfortable having a challenging conversation. I think we live in an era where there are these sort of flashpoints, but they're not sort of connected or explained or unpacked necessarily within a daily news context as well as they potentially could be. And the listeners become a place where you can kind of have a smart person go and talk to a bunch of people and synthesize it into something bigger. Do you, how quickly did you sort of glom onto that as a real opportunity for you and figure out who your bench of people to create it was?
I think it sort of grows organically. The first few weeks, months in the role, I didn't know which way was up. And I was having, quite serious buyer's remorse about joining, quite honestly, because, I'd come from this leisurely place of monthly magazines where you have a crunchy week, but everything else is thinking time.
Remember it well. I miss it. I miss it every day.
So it was about getting myself up to speed. But then I think, as I say, I like to work really collegially, and I like to tap everybody for ideas. We have, a weekly story meet, and some of our best cover lines, some of the most genius cover lines, are written by our art director, Derek Ward.
Well, today's these are so the
Shakespearean ones across the top.
Bad taste, and now is the winter of our disconnect. These are almost Economist level.
Enter McFluff.
Yeah, that's pretty. It's a pretty strong cover this week. I recommend. It's probably going to be off newsstands by the time this goes out. Podcasts just can't keep up with your print people.
So those, I don't know. I think it's. I don't know. I think it's just about sort of working collaboratively as much as possible, and with some of the key writers that contribute to us. It's just having really good conversations and catch-ups with them and, what are you thinking about? And you just did that story. Is there something further we can do here? We are reliant on a good network of freelancers, but we're pretty tough. I mean, everything's edited virtually. I do the first edit as sort of a top edit and a read and go back with any questions. And then we have such fantastic subs. You know, we really grind through every word is passed, and people like our chief sub, Jeff Cumming, I mean, just chucked him a story today, a big sort of infrastructure story, which I know Jeff will just be, so happy with that, isn't it? So we all play to different strengths, but, if your art director is actually the driest wit in the house who can write the funniest lines, why would you not use them?
That's just a very good way of kind of summing up how the sort of dream state of a magazine where everyone just kind of forges together to put something out and then takes a day to recover and on to the next one.
Starts it all again.
Well, congratulations to both of you. Honestly, I think that the country is so much poorer without a kind of rich and vibrant magazine ecosystem. And I think that to take the calamity of Bauer and build what you've done with our and the listener in particular, from my own personal preferences, it's a magical thing, and it's so good to have it back in my life. And thank you both for coming up to talk about it.
Thanks very much, Duncan.
Thank you, Duncan.